Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Two Republics, where we explore the biggest ideas shaping the future of US-India relations and global development through youth-led conversations. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Anit Mukherjee, a senior fellow at ORF America, where he leads program on global economics and development policy. His work focuses on how emerging technologies, especially digital public infrastructure, can transform financial inclusion, development finance, and public service delivery across the global South. Dr. Mukherjee brings deep insight to how intersection of economics, governance, and technology. Before ORF, he was a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development and an associate professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi. His research has shaped conversations at the World Bank, UN, and across global development platforms, and he's been a leading voice on how digital payment systems can serve as models for inclusive growth worldwide. Dr. Mukherjee, thank you so much for being with us. It's a real pleasure to have you on Two Republics.
Thank you, Kirav. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
You've worked in various countries, including India, Japan, and Brazil, focusing on digital public infrastructure and financial inclusion. What motivated you to pursue these areas, and how do you see technology as a key tool for addressing development challenges in emerging economies?
Well, first of all, I think now without technology, there is no development. And I started off by saying that development outcomes will be better and faster and easier achieved if we use technology appropriately. And my career kind of happened, my professional life. I mean, I did my PhD in Japan. I came back to India in 2004. And that was when in India, we invested quite significantly on health, education, expanding school infrastructure and teachers, appointing teachers. In fact, some estimates put it that 200 million kids were put into school within a 5-7 year period. Similarly, there were health centers going up, so we expanded the health infrastructure, and there was a lot of money being invested in these social programs. And one thing that through my being in India, being in Brazil, having lived in Japan and in other countries, I realized that there is this common thread that binds our development experience, and that is good governance. And in these countries, and even in Japan, which is an advanced economy, governments are efficient or should be efficient to achieve development outcomes. And as we were moving into the era of technology, and those were the days when even having a website where you could download data from different schools, for example, how many kids are coming to school that attend. Brazil showed us a way because they were doing cash transfers for mothers who would send their kids to school and take them to health centers. So I think I thought at that time that, India could actually lead in that path. And it so happened that we started the biometric ID program, Aadhaar, in 2009, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that initial group. And we realized the power of technology. But the power of technology not only for doing something as basic as tracking children into school and paying mothers, for example, for sending their kids to school or taking or having a delivery at the health center instead of at the home, we realized that there's so much more that can be done. And that is where the idea of digital public infrastructure came. And I think in some way, the different elements of that were using the biometric ID system to be used for payments, to be used for connecting across different databases. It's a bit wonky, but what we call it the India stack today. And over time, over the last 15 years, Kirav, I think we have seen what we are looking at a leapfrogging of India and other developing countries, and I'll come to that later on, in terms of how quickly can we achieve our goals, development goals. And as an economist, as a development economist, I think there was no better time than now than that the last 15 years that to see this change. And we are at the cusp of another big change with new models and new technology like AI and machine learning exponentially growing. So that was my my goal, and I've tried to stay true to the fact that I still do research work and looking at actually how these systems are being implemented. What are the bottlenecks? Sometimes technology is not the solution. The solution is somebody actually sitting down with a village mom to say, what do you want? What is it that you want from the government, or how can the government serve you better? So I think that human element with technology is something that I really hold deeply in my heart.
That's great. It's really insightful about your story all across the world and how they're human stories beyond technology. India has become a leader in digital public infrastructure with initiatives like Aadhaar and UPI. For our viewers, can you first explain what these models are and how can they be adapted and scaled to help other developing nations achieve similar outcomes in their financial inclusion and public service delivery?
Yes, I think that's a fair point. Not everybody understands what Aadhaar and UPI and all the digital stack that we talk about. So let me first start with Aadhaar. If you go back 20 years, I'm talking about 2005, there used to be periodic census that would collect how many people lived in the country in India and where were they located, right? Um, but those were anonymized, de-identified data that you didn't know who is actually living in that address. But it gave us a sense of different kinds of things, the type of housing, whether they send their kids to school, whether this family has enough to live on, whether they own a car or a bicycle. But we didn't have, and the census was every 10 years, right? We didn't have one ID, one identity document to prove who I claimed to be. So if I'm Anit Mukherjee, I go to a court and I say, my name is Anit Mukherjee. How do you prove that I claim to be Anit Mukherjee, and how do you prove that that's the same person? There were at least 15 or 17 ways of proving your identity before a court or for any legal document. It could be your bank account statement, it could be a job card from the government, it could be your driving license, of course, but very few people have driving license. But most importantly, there was the election ID card. And we realized that all these had problems. There were duplicates. There were people who were in the database who were not alive, for example, right? And we thought that, okay, how can we solve this? And the solution that we thought about was using biometrics. And by then, in 2009, 2010, there were two things that are happening. The biometric identification standards and the accuracy was getting very sharp. And this happened after 2001, the 9/11, when the US kind of set the standards for Customs and Border Patrol to fingerprint you, right? When you came in at the visa, when you got a visa, you had to give your fingerprint, and then when you came in, you had to put your fingerprint in a machine. So from 2001 to 2010, there was a huge advancement in biometric technology. Now we use it as common, right? Like you hold our cell phones in front of our face, and lo and behold, the phone unlocks, right? Thankfully, I have small kids, so they can't unlock my phone without using their faces. So there is that accuracy there. But then the challenge was, how do we, if you have an ID system, then it has to be for everyone. Otherwise, it will be a haves and have-nots. So you needed to have this system for all 1.3 and now 1.4 billion people. How do you do that? And we thought, well, it would be quite a nice challenge. Right? So we started rolling out the ID, biometric ID. I remember it's September 2011, 2011 was the first issuance. And in another 5 years, we had reached 1 billion. And that's a different story. That's a story of scale up. And therefore, the ID, when everyone has an ID, like a biometric ID, where if you go to a bank and you say, I'm so-and-so, I want to open an account, the bank documents, the basic document is to prove your ID, right? Your identity, and that you are not a fake person, right? And that is what facilitated what we call the electronic KYC, know your customer. And that's a standard that central bank sets. There's a global standard. So the biometric ID essentially allowed you to open bank accounts for 500 million people who didn't have bank accounts at that time. And this created this base of people with an ID, which is accepted and which is non-refutable, which means you can use it and you can update it. And secondly, a mass of 1 billion people with a financial account. So these two things together, along with the spread of cell phones, the smartphones, not the previous ones, maybe your viewers don't even remember that how the cell phones used to look like. They're probably in a museum somewhere. But there used to be phones which didn't have any kind of way in which you could,
Right,
prove
right.
who you are. So I think where we came was that if you have these three things, a biometric ID, a bank account, and enabled by cell phones, smartphones, you could do magic. You could basically do anything, right? That's limited by your imagination what you could do. And that's where I think the UPI, or what we call the Unified Payments Interface, happened. And that's a different kind of system than a credit card system or a bank transfer system that you have in the US, which is important for your viewers to know. It's based on a protocol, like your email goes under the simple mail transfer protocol. It's called SMTP. The internet functions on a protocol, which is the HTTP, hypertext transfer protocol. So the whole of the internet or the digital development happened through protocols. And we thought that, to have this kind of an openness where different databases could talk to each other, we needed a protocol. So UPI, Unified Payments Interface, is actually a protocol. And that is how money is transferred between banks through different kinds of apps, fintechs. It could be anything. So that also, I think just to summarize, I think those two, having an ID, having a financial address where anyone can send to anyone, like it doesn't matter whether you are a client of one bank, say Wells Fargo or Citibank, and you can only send to those clients. So we broke the silos. And therefore, the whole of 1.1 billion people who have a financial address became your client and became your market. And that's where this whole fintech revolution started in India. And I think over time, you've seen how those systems have become better. Those systems, yes, there are challenges. I'm not saying that there aren't. I think we have to be very careful about fraud prevention. We have to be very careful about digital literacy. Not everyone can handle those systems. My parents, for example, are over 8 years old. My mother can do it. My father can't. So you have to also take into account for people who can use these systems and who can't. Those who can't still have to use checks or cards. So I think that has been our philosophy. And the philosophy is we want to go from scale what works, which is you start small and then scale up, to you build at scale. You build for 1.4 billion. You don't think that there will be only 200 million who will be using it, but you have fallback option for people who are not able to use those systems.
Right. I think it's very important. You beautifully described what Aadhaar and UPI is, because those are very, complex concepts and ingenious inventions. We were talking earlier about, for example, Starlink, and how cell services in collaboration between US and India, how Starlink as a cell service can enter the Indian market, and the importance of US-India collaboration. What are the key opportunities for the United States and India to collaborate on digital finance services, particularly in the context of expanding financial inclusion in the Global South?
That's, I think, a very valid question, because I think the first point to note is that the US-India technology collaboration is far bigger than just digital financial services.
Right.
It spans a gamut of things from even now increasingly defense, but also things like cyber coordination. Um, and I mentioned that how India took on the national NIST standards, the US standards for biometrics, and built on that. So I think we already have examples of US-India collaboration, maybe not in a direct sense, but US as a standard setter, and we have built on those standards. We meaning not only India, but other countries as well. Now, coming to how we can go forward, I think there are two things, Kairav, that's happening. One is that given how the world of digital payments are looking like, they have moved far beyond what the US has today, like a card-based, even paper check-based system, which is not interoperable, meaning you're still stuck with different
Right.
banks with doing different things. And these what we call legacy systems. These are very difficult to change. So for on the digital payment side, I think it would be important for India and the US to understand that we can learn from each other. It's not that, there is any system is better or worse, but I think at least for small payments, the everyday payments, Indian system has moved far ahead, and the US can learn how we've done it. And it's not only India, it's also Brazil, it's also other countries which have, digital payment systems which are very advanced, right? Um, on the on this, what I think would be very helpful for India and the US to collaborate on is on the standards, right? Is on the compliance and the standards, which I think the US system has very sophisticated backends where you have the financial switches, the card companies have enormous payment capability. They have been doing it for decades. So I think there is a need for the legacy systems which are in the US, which are card-based or bank-based, that can also tell us how we can have multiple systems. Like people in India would still like to have a credit card because the UPI is an instant payment. So you have to have you have money in your bank account, right? But as we develop, the credit becomes an important part of your daily life. Like we all use credit card. That means we buy today, we pay in 45 days. And how you manage that credit system in a digital format, I think there is a lot of potential for collaboration. I'm going a little bit wonky, but I think in some ways to understand the challenges and also the opportunities of countries like India and other countries putting in new systems vis-a-vis very advanced, sophisticated systems that the US has for a long time. I think there are many, many potential ways of collaboration. And by the way, I think, in many of these systems, I work closely with Brazil as well, fraud is a very important issue. And the US, because of its way in which the digital payment systems have been built or through credit cards and bank transfers, I think the fraud filters are far bigger, far better in sophistication than we have in other countries. So I think there is a lot of potential, but I think what I want your viewers to take away from this is that in the digital space, US is just one player, and innovations are happening across the world, which I think is also important for the US, the United States, to understand what is happening in other countries and how they can also learn from us as well as learn from the US as well.
Yeah, just adding on to that point, and especially off of that, there are other countries besides the United States that are, leading these initiatives. Like you just mentioned, India is actually far, off of your point, far ahead in these terms of digital payments, while America still has a legacy side with the credit cards, checks, and bank. Multilateral development banks and global institutions often play a crucial role in framing these infrastructure projects. What changes do you think are needed in these institutions to better support these initiatives, especially in maybe, let's say, developing countries that are trying to, go over these traditional and legacy banking systems?
Right. Excellent question. So, the multilateral development banks, say the World Bank or international, the Asian Development Bank. I'm leaving IMF out of the. I'm talking, focusing on the development banks per se. There are these regional banks like the African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank. These are the big four. But there are also regional developments. For example, Caribbean has a regional development bank. So I think for a long time, Kira, there has been this talk of these institutions were founded at the aftermath of the Second World War, 1945, Bretton Woods, and you know the story. Um, and they've not kept up with what countries need or demand today, right? So it is, and there is some truth to it, but it's also a little bit of an unfair criticism sometimes that I feel that people make, that banks have changed significantly. Their mandates have changed. Today, World Bank is funding not only infrastructure, but also, as you mentioned, different digital governance systems. They're funding health, funding education, funding climate change. So what needs to change in the multilateral development institutions, which are the big regional and global institutions like the World Bank, is to see what countries need, what are the objectives of the countries. Say, and I take the digital payments, for example. I did some work with the Democratic Republic of Congo, and during COVID, there was a lot of focus on how you transfer money directly, this COVID relief. There's sometimes it was $20 or $30, but it made a huge difference to transferring this money directly without somebody going into a bank and having the danger of contracting COVID. So COVID actually changed the whole ecosystem of digital payments in many countries of the world. And I was pleasantly surprised when I saw that the World Bank, and also others like the Asian Development Bank and other multilateral institutions were taking on board this need for new ways of providing money. At the same time, they're banks. Let's not forget that. So they have their checks and balances. They have their safeguards. So sometimes there was this conflict between what you needed to do very quickly and what was important, and the safeguards that needed to happen because they are banks. They're credit rated. They're credit rating agencies that rate them. So I thought that there was a lot of very good things that happened where they understood each other, the countries and the multilateral banks, that they needed to be flexible, right? And I think that flexibility is something that needs to percolate not only digital payments, but on several kinds of projects. For example, I would give you an example. We are really falling back on our climate goals, right? So if a country comes and says, I want to install, say, 100 megawatts of solar capacity in the next 2 years, if the project itself takes 2 years to be approved, then the
Yeah.
project period becomes 5 years. Like you have to do the contracting, you have to do the procurement. So I think there are small steps that these banks, multilateral institutions are understanding the need for speed. Let's put it that way. But it's difficult because of the systems that already exist. This is the same thing as a legacy system in payments that we were talking about. So one change that I see, and I would really appreciate seeing it more. I mean, the World Bank IMF spring meetings are next week, that different countries are coming, the the finance ministers and central bank governors will be here to say we need to have a quicker and more responsive project proposals, funding, this whole cycle. And sometimes those hit also the political cycle. Don't forget that. Like some countries, the elections come and then a project is approved or not approved within 6 months makes a huge difference, right? So I think that's the one thing that would help, where the banks, the multilateral development banks, are responsive to the country's need, both in terms of what they need and how they need it and how quickly they need it.
Right. No, I think it's very important to, and you great outlined how these countries can um, not only go off of their old systems, but create their new platforms as well. As a final question, students and young professionals who are interested in global development and digital transformation, what steps would you recommend for people like me and whoever are interested in this field to take to get involved and areas such as India-US relations or digital finance and advancing sustainable development goals? What would your advice be?
I think my biggest advice, or if I can say that, is global development is not going away. The topics might change. Today, everybody is exercised about tariffs and trade and
Right.
what it means for different countries. But the basic issue is, how can the world become better, more sustainable over the long term? But in the short term, what are those challenges of health, of education, of climate, of energy, we talked about digital payments a lot, financial inclusion, banking, I mean, access to credit. All these issues remain, right? So I think in some way we all, like, I started studying economics after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So in a sense, my the way that I learned economics was the previous theories and the new theories of globalization. What does globalization look like? What are the changes that would happen?
Yeah.
So I think, for as somebody who's been through where you are, and I didn't honestly also know what path I would choose, but I think it's important to, just for your viewers to know, that you can engage in many different topics. Something that piques your interest, that you can choose today, and there's a lot of change going on in the world in many different areas. So that's one. I think be curious, and if something is like, why is this happening, right? Why is tariffs like a floor tariff of 10%? It seems a small number, but why is it so important for countries? How would it affect them? How would it affect a Congo versus a Sri Lanka versus a India versus China is another matter we didn't talk about. But I think that is something, care of, that over your career, and your people who watch this, your friends who watch it, I think you will see many changes, and changes are rapid. But at the basic level, the challenges of global development is not going away. And those are for young people like you, the next generation, to actually figure out what is it that you want to do and how you want to affect policy, or how you affect, how the people's lives are changing. And that, I think, even if we work at policy, where I now work mostly on policy or research, or any way that you can do. Some people might go into the field and do the field report. There are many different ways of doing it. But at the base of it is, how do you make the lives of people better, both in the developing countries and in the developed countries? Because sometimes the challenges of a rural Pennsylvania or a rural Kansas is very similar to a rural India or a rural Brazil or rural Kenya. And the aspirations are very similar. The challenges are very similar. So even if you are used to one context, which maybe for you and for many of your viewers is the US context, it could translate into understanding what is happening in other places.
Yeah, definitely that line where you said that global development is not going away is very important, especially for the young generation as well. I would like to thank you so much for sharing your experience and your advice and your insight on digital payment systems, India-US relations, and policy in general.
Thank you, Kerav. It was a pleasure, and I wish you all the best.